On this day 30 years ago, I was on Ben Croghan in the southern Highlands. There was sleet, hail, strong winds and a dense mist. The rocks were slippery, I had a big pack, and I was wondering what I was doing there, especially as it was the third day of a long walk I was setting out on over all the Munros and Tops listed in Munro's tables, of which at the time there were 517. So not just the main Munros, which is what most people are doing when they say they're doing the Munros, but all the subsidiary tops as well. And the weather at the start was not good, and it was not good for the first week. Overall, that summer was wet and windy, and not unusual for the Scottish Highlands, but rather wetter and windier than I would have liked. There were sunny days, of course, but the longest continuous period of sunshine was only 6 days, whereas the longest periods of mist and rain were considerably more than that. But it was still a great adventure, and I did complete the 517 summits. I walked very approximately 1,770 miles and climbed 275,000 feet. I say approximately because I wasn't measuring these. In fact, there wasn't in those days an easy way to do it, because of course this was long before smartphones. GPS had just come in, but GPS units were heavy, clumsy, not that reliable, and anyway all they gave you was a grid reference. There was no mapping to look at, so you then had to translate the grid reference onto the map to see where you were. And I had decided that I was so used to map and compass that would do me for the walk, and I didn't need this newfangled GPS thing. And map and compass did. There was one instance when I got a bit mislaid and a GPS might have been useful, but overall I didn't need it. And there was an awful lot of quite difficult navigation in mist to be undertaken, especially for the tops. The Munros, of course, were well mapped. There were paths to all the summits, though not necessarily the ones you'd take if you were doing subsidiary tops as well, and they're all named on the Ordnance Survey maps. Now the tops aren't. The only ones with paths were the ones that lie in between Munros, so people go over them because that's the easiest way, but plenty of them are out on spurs, the end of long ridges, and there are no paths to them, and quite a few of them are not in fact named on the Ordnance Survey maps. So one of my tasks before the walk was to go through Munro's tables, which gives the grid references for all the tops, and highlight them on the maps. That was the only way I felt I could be certain that I had actually visited all of them. So that made both the planning and the walking interesting. It was a backpacking trip. That's how I wanted to do it. I camped out most nights. I used a bicycle for some of the road sections. I don't really like walking on roads. Otherwise, I walked the whole way, with the exception of ferries to Mull and to Skye. Now, I was following in the footsteps and using the same pattern as Hamish Brown, whose wonderful book, still one of my favourites, Hamish's Mountain Walk, was the inspiration. This is the story of his walk over all the Munros, which was the first time they'd been done as a continuous walk. And ever since reading it, I thought I'd really like to do that, but I wanted some sort of variation, which is why I decided I'd include the tops as well, especially when I discovered that, certainly as far as any records went, no one was known to have done the Munros and Tops in one long walk before. So that was a bit of a challenge, and also made for, as I said, some interesting planning. But in May, the end of May, 30 years ago, as I say, the weather was pretty stormy and cold for the time of year, and I was only just equipped for it because this was a summer walk. After a few weeks the weather changed, and although it was often wet, it wasn't cold anymore, and everything I brought with me worked fine. It's the longest walk in the UK I've ever done, and in fact the third longest walk ever. The only walks I've done that are longer are the Pacific Crest Trail and the Continental Divide Trail in the USA. Having done those and quite a lot of other long walks, I felt I was probably up to tackling the Munros and Tops, because whilst you don't have the long stretches without resupply or the altitude of those American walks, the weather is far stormier than in the USA. There wasn't a single night during the walk when I slept out under the stars. The only times there was weather later in the walk when I could have done, it was mid-season, so there was no way I was not going to have the tent up and the doors closed. But as I say, it was a fantastic walk. Looking back on it now, some of it astonishes me. Some of the things, some of the long days that I did, 25 miles and thousands of feet of ascent. But of course, on a long walk like that, you get fitter as you go along. After the walk, I wrote a book about it. Of course, at that time I was writing a book on each of the long walks I did, or collections of stories about the long walks. The one on this walk, here it is, the Munros and Tops, an explanatory but rather mundane title, not sure why it ended up with that, but the paperback version, which is this, is still in print. It was in the hardback, that's long gone. It tells in detail the story of the whole walk. There are some colour pictures in the middle, though only a fraction of those I took. But anyway, it's published by Mainstream Press, and I say it's still available if you're interested in reading any more about this long walk. One of the most, in fact, unusual walks I've ever done, because normally long walks are A to B walks, and I've always viewed it, if you set off from A and you reach B, then you have completed the walk. There may be variations in the route along the way, but as long as you walked it all, that's all that matters. However, if you're summit bagging, it's not like that. I had 517 points to visit, 517 summits, and the walk would only be completed if I had visited everyone and had done the whole trip under my own steam, other, as I say, than ferries. So it was not an A to B walk, and there weren't sections that I could say, oh, I'm going to take a lower route here because the weather's so bad, or even, as I have done, think, oh no, I'm going to stay up high and not bother following, you know, the footpath or an official route. No, I had to join those 517 dots. And that meant as well that on the map, it's just a complete tangle of lines, because I was zigzagging about all over the place, doing the hills in groups, but the way they're distributed means you can't just start in the south and go all the way to the north. You have to go east at times, west at times. Sometimes you're going south, sometimes you're going north. Overall, my direction was north because I was going to finish on Ben Hope, the most northerly, but I didn't start on the most southerly. I started on Mull because that's got one Munro, it's an island, it's out on its own, so I thought, well, I'll get that over with first. But as I say, the route is a complete tangle, you know, of lines all over the map. But the planning was fun, the execution was even more enjoyable, of course, and some of the lines I'd drawn on the map didn't make sense on the ground, or the weather meant that I changed plans, done some hills before I'd done others, but it all worked out in the end, and I finished on Ben Hope after a successful walk. And I hope you've enjoyed me reminiscing about it all these years later, and like the pictures. So for anyone who has got this far, thank you for watching.